Kate, welcome to Waterstones.
Thank you, it's lovely to be here.
I have a very vague memory from my childhood of going to Madame Tussauds, to the Chamber of Horrors, and seeing various things there that I was equally thrilled and terrified of. And I do remember this sort of slightly creepy looming presence of John Christie in Rillington Place, in what was a bizarrely domestic scene, it seemed to me, amongst all the other sort of horrors that were there. And then I sort of put it away and I've not thought about it since. And then I picked up your book and you took me right back to the Chamber of Horrors. Why did you want to write about Rillington Place and John Christie now? What was it that's grabbed your attention recently?
Well, I guess I think maybe I saw him in the Chamber of Horrors too, but it's a very dim memory. And I saw the film 10 Rillington Place on TV sometime in my teens, really terrifying. And but I remember it sort of vaguely, just as something quite disturbing. And it came back to me in 2020, 2021, where there were some very sort of disturbing murders of women in London by men who didn't know them, men who were strangers to them. And in some cases would say they were on a mission to kill a number of women. And having always sort of taken it just as a fact of life that there were some men out there who chose to kill women, or because they were women, basically, I suddenly thought, well, but why? You know, what's going on there? And I remembered the Rillington Place story dimly. I think he was a serial killer of women. And so I looked it up and started to research more about him, what he did and so on, and became intrigued and felt like it was a story from the past that might help me understand something about the present.
Right, okay, that's really interesting because, as you say, this motivation, if you like, is not clear. There are still some things about the case that aren't entirely sort of sorted, but you clearly went and did some amazing research, and the framing of the story is not so much, I suppose, focusing on Christie, but two other people, Harry Proctor, who was a journalist, and Fryn Tennyson Jesse, who was a journalist and writer. And you sort of tell the story through their approach to it, which I thought was really, really interesting. Would you mind telling me, I suppose, who of those two you found first and why you decided to tell the story from their eyes?
I realised quite early on that this guy, Harry Proctor, who was a tabloid journalist, an incredibly successful, tenacious, ruthless tabloid journalist, had been pretty much first on the scene when Christie was caught, when his crimes were discovered at 10 Rillington Place. And Fryn Tennyson Jesse, she wrote a really fascinating 100-page essay in the 1950s about the case, and she had been present at Christie's trial and was completely fascinated by his psychology. And so it occurred to me that by following the case through their eyes, shadowing them, as it were, it would help me like get right into that moment to kind of see Christie as he was seen then, but also to somehow reflect on and work out what I was doing as a person writing about a real crime and some of the attractions of that, but also the dangers, the risks, the moral risks, and to see how they handled that and how different we are now from then in the way we approach these stories. So he was the more, tabloidy, sensationalist, get the material, the gore and the drama, and her approach was more kind of high-minded in that she was trying to study his psychology and to work out what had really happened in the house, because there were some mysteries about it, as you suggest. So from those two angles, they were both kind of relaying these crimes as kind of as entertainment or as food for thought, and it was fascinating to see how they contended with that.
There's a really fascinating aspect to Harry Proctor's view, I suppose, which is that he had had contact with Christie previously, so that when in the same building there had been a murder which had been pinned on another man, Christie had actually been one of the expert witnesses at that trial. And it turns out later that, of course, Christie was the person who had killed this woman and her child. And you suggest that Harry had this kind of lingering guilt, I suppose, that he hadn't realised that at the time, and so he wanted Christie to confess to that murder and get the other man off. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so when Harry Proctor turned up at the house in Rillington Place, a very dingy little street in Notting Hill, in 1953, he realised he'd been there before, and he had interviewed Christie before. Christie was by now on the run because the police had found the bodies of all these women in his kitchen wall, under the floorboards in the garden. And Harry Proctor realised he'd interviewed Christie when his upstairs neighbour had been charged with a double murder, in fact, in 1949. And this neighbour had confessed to the murders, but then he changed his story and said Christie did it. When the case came to trial, everyone believed Christie, who testified against his neighbour, and the young man from the top floor flat was convicted of murdering his baby daughter and was hanged. And Harry hadn't really questioned Christie that closely that night because he seemed such a respectable middle-aged man. He sort of took it as a given that he was telling the truth and the sort of van driver upstairs was lying. And when he realised that Christie was a serial killer 3 years later, he was absolutely horrified. He prided himself on being like the greatest investigative reporter in the land, and he had missed this story that was right under his nose. And not only had an innocent man perhaps been hanged, but Christie had been able to continue killing for 3 years. So he had a very personal investment in the story, and his motivations were therefore quite complicated. He wanted to redeem himself. But he also wanted to get the scoop that would sell millions of copies of his paper. And so he was driven both by the sort of Fleet Street hunger for this sensational story, but also by a desire to make good on his mistake. And he was absolutely convinced that Tim Evans had been innocent and that Christie had killed Tim Evans' wife and baby.
There's a fascinating quote that you unearthed, which was another journalist talking about Harry. And this person said that he didn't just report a story, he infiltrated it, embedded himself, then owned it, then manipulated its protagonists as puppeteer-in-chief so that everything fell into place as, when, and exactly how he wished. Now, you mentioned that you were sort of interrogating your own approach to writing whilst looking at Harry and Fryn. How does that quote compare to your own approach to telling a story?
Yeah, there's a way in which, as a writer of non-fiction, of history, there's a kind of, and I everything in my books is factual so far as I hope, and there's no like made up dialogue or anything like that. So it can seem as if it's just you're just delivering kind of unvarnished truth, but of course you're telling a story you want to tell in the order you want to tell it, and the work of a non-fiction author, just as much in a different way as a tabloid journalist, is arranging facts, selecting facts, editing things, telling things from particular points of view, in a way to make the story your own, to tell the story you want to tell, and which you think is most interesting and true in a subjective way as well as an objective one. So that sense, it's always worth having in the back of your mind. How far do you go with that kind of organisation of material, and to make sure that it still has the sort of integrity. It's still true.
Yeah.
and it's you're not leaving out things that are important that might have a reader be able to have a different reading of the case, to kind of include the counter arguments and things like that. But it's always a danger that the story becomes kind of too much your own, and you depart from that kind of objectivity that you're partly aiming for.
Yeah. One of the ways in which you rather brilliantly sort of, I suppose, marshal the material is through the title, in a way, the Peepshow. You mentioned that for reporters, everything in life is a peep show. And then there's a slightly different thing for Fryn, which is that she had actually written a novel which was called a pin to see the Peepshow, and you describe a moment in it where a girl becomes completely fascinated by a little model box that a boy has made, where she can peer through, and there are all these little figures inside it, except they're all kind of the wrong size and perspective's all wrong. But she's sort of fascinated by this idea of sort of being on the outside looking in. And you mentioned that Frynn's approach, I suppose, to this case was similar, but again, because of something in her past that was sort of lurking, the slight sense of something had been wrong in her family that she didn't quite understand. And this case gave her a chance to investigate a house that was odd and bad and not quite right. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, I think the title, The Peepshow, and as you say, both the tabloid shenanigans that Harry Procter was getting up to, and the true crime analysis that Frynn was doing, in a way they are sort of peep shows. It's both these people and me are kind of driven by a nosiness, a sort of curiosity about what's going on in other people's lives, and the ways in which that can somehow express something about your own feelings or your own preoccupations. And there is a danger all the time of practicing some of the same voyeurism that Christie did. Christie, the serial killer, was a voyeur who liked to take photographs of naked women to spy on his neighbours, and the whole business of researching and reporting true crime, any kind of history really, but true crime in particular, can feel intrusive, can feel like sort of stalking people through history, gawping at these sensational events. And so it was interesting to see that, that the Peepshow was something that Frynn and Harry had in common, as a sort of a sense of them kind of living vicariously through these other lives. And it was something that was also applicable to what I was doing, and to what Christie, the serial killer, was doing, was constructing a kind of Peepshow, which we were all in danger of replaying, for the public. And so that tricky territory was like really interesting to me, the way in which he's straying onto some very kind of morally murky territory. Yeah.
You described brilliantly actually as Frynn wanting to get basically a ticket to the Peepshow, wanting to get into the trial, and the desperate attempts that she made to do that, asking, calling in every favour that she could. But you mentioned that, of course, this was a trial that really caught a lot of people's attention, and there's sort of almost celebrity guests watching it. Cecil Beaton was there, Terence Rattigan, the playwright, was there.
Yes, he couldn't stop. He had to leave before the end. Yeah. It was too horrible. But,
tell me a bit about that. Sort of what it must have been like at the time of it happening. What the atmosphere would have been like around the trial.
Well, it had been 1953 was a very the Queen was crowned that summer, and in the same month as Christie's trials, and these were kind of the twin kind of huge news events of the year, were Christie's arrest and trial and the Queen's coronation at Westminster Abbey. And Cecil Beaton, curiously, was at both. So he was there in Westminster Abbey watching the coronation, and then he took the official camera portraits of the Queen, which are really gorgeous. And then, like 2 weeks later, he's in the Old Bailey listening to the details of this terrible case being rehearsed, where an apparently respectable middle-aged man with horn-rimmed glasses and very sort of morally upright, apparently had gassed, strangled and raped a series of women. And the contrast between the kind of pomp and ceremony of that moment and the great hope and optimism that Elizabeth would be ushering in a new age for Britain after a long period of austerity and deprivation. But then that deprivation kind of rearing out from this address at 10 Rillington Place and being put on show in the Old Bailey and reported on, every paper. Just the coverage is astonishing. Lots of diagrams of the house and sketches of the interior, photographs of Christie himself, endless photographs of Christie and his victims, and an incredibly detailed account of the proceedings inside court. So it was like a sort of twin entertainment, the dark and the light, and the low life, the working class life of of London and the high life, the royals, and so it seemed a very dramatic juxtaposition, and Cecil Beaton went between the two. And yes, the case itself was there were queues outside for people wanting to get in, and the seats in the guest seats in the Old Bailey were very hotly sought out. Frin, Tennyson Jessie went almost mad trying to get herself a place in the court. And then, so sort of Terence Rattigan, Margaret Leighton, the actress who'd starred in Hitchcock films and in Rattigan's plays, was there. Some newspaper men. And it was interesting to me, a lot of the people who wanted to be there, both the sort of celebrities but also the people queuing outside, sort of Londoners, were women. And this, I noticed it before, when reporting on criminal trials and so on. It's often noted with disapproval how many women are kind of turning up wanting to hear about this violence, and that was very intriguing to me too, being a woman who was reporting on it. And Frin Jessie was quite an interesting figure to explore that through.
You mentioned earlier that part of your reason for wanting to write the book was to try and understand why he killed these women, because you are a woman. And I think a lot of women, as you say, will attend trials like that or have an interest in true crime because what they're trying to do is to understand what is the danger out there, what can I do potentially to protect myself from these men. Do you feel like you're any closer to understanding what did motivate John Christie?
Yes, closer. I think there's I sort of learned everything I could about his life and his habits and his words. He wrote an extremely long confession for Harry Proctor for publication in the Sunday Pictorial, only a portion of which went in. But I've seen the original documents, so you get quite a lot of material about how he saw himself. And there's this absolutely startling disjunction between the pride he takes in, like, he's good at first aid, he's a sort of referee in the trade union football matches, he insists that he doesn't drink, hardly ever, doesn't go into pubs, doesn't swear, looks after his pets, and he seems to see no sort of difficulty matching that to the fact he in the same breath kind of admit to, oh yes, well I gassed that one and then I did this and that, and I think I picked up her skull and took it round the corner, and this he's in a way a kind of caricature of the mid-century respectable Englishman. He served as a policeman, he was in the army, injured in the First World War. And yet he's got this absolute sort of blank darkness in him as well. And it was interesting to me to sort of see how some of the ways he thought about the world matched the ways that the attitudes that were actually pervasive in 1950s Britain and were echoed in the newspaper coverage of the case. And so I was really intrigued by being able to trace the links between who he was and the society that had shaped him and that was then reporting and reflecting on him. These kinds of stories where these really sort of strong emotions can be like fantastic portals into the kind of emotional life of a historical moment, not just his, but the women he killed, whose lives are scantily but still there, documented in the archives, and the people who read about him and who watched him and who thought about him. You get access to their fears and their fantasies and their anxieties, and something as lurid as a murder story can open up a whole vein of a whole area where you can kind of see into people's hearts and minds a little bit, and that is really, it sort of animates the period in a way that other stories often don't, and it also sheds light on the corners of society that are not usually well recorded, the poorer lives, and the lives of sort of immigrants to London. Several of the women he killed were recent arrivals in London, and he and his wife shared a house with some West Indian migrants who had come over in the late 40s, and he couldn't stand them. The extraordinary racist outbursts he had. And so it all seemed, you got access to those sorts of attitudes too, and the lives of his neighbours.
You very importantly do shine a light on the women that were killed by John Christie to find out why they had contact with him, what brought them into his path. And for many of them, he was exploiting these weaknesses that existed because they were women. It was the need for an abortion, perhaps, or poverty, alcoholism, prostitution, things like that. And right now, we're living in a time where it feels as though women's rights are being chipped away at again in some countries. And I wonder whether, as you say, looking at this period and getting a real light into the society of that day through the case, how it feels for you to be writing that in 2024 and what women are dealing with today.
Yeah, a lot of his victims were vulnerable to him, were lured to his house because they didn't have enough money. They were nearly all single women, and at the time, the fact that he was rumoured to be an abortionist, a backstreet abortionist, were minimised by the courts, by the press. But looking through the archive, I just found so much evidence of it, and I also realised that just about every woman he'd killed had been rumoured to be pregnant or was pregnant or was recently pregnant at the time he killed her. And so I'm pretty sure this was his main kind of trap. So the fact that abortion was illegal made them incredibly vulnerable to being preyed on. I mean, backstreet abortions were dangerous anyway. You wouldn't normally face the danger of being murdered, but these women did. And it was because they were paid too little, even in regular jobs, to bring up a child on their own. Their babies would have been taken away from them if they'd gone to term. That so many women did resort to this really sort of desperate option of getting a backstreet abortion. So the women at the time, one of the pathologists in the case sort of described the women, his victims, as prostitutes. And there was one of his victims who was like a full-time prostitute. She was alcoholic. But the others, maybe they sometimes traded sex for money, but because they were so hard up and because that's how women got by, single women might get by in London, and some married women. But by stigmatising them in that way, the pathologist sort of said, their lives weren't really worth living. It was no great loss to society. They're better off dead. And this was a sort of widespread attitude, and it enabled the coverage really to be quite sort of electrified, and there wasn't that much pity in it, It was much, there was something kind of excited about the way that this case was covered, and very little thought or information about the individual women's lives and their families and what they'd done in the weeks or months or years before they were murdered. So I did try to piece together those things, and yes, it was not just Christie who killed them, but the social circumstances that made them vulnerable to him. So that seemed worth teasing out. And of course, you do see it, or especially in some of the politics in America at the moment, that abortion is sort of back on the table as something that could be made illegal, and so backstreet abortions would come into. So it does feel all, unfortunately, very live still.
The other thing that the case really, I suppose, shone a light on was the death penalty. With Christie being convicted of these murders and the suggestion that Evans had been innocent and hung for a crime he didn't commit, it was this in a way part of the catalyst to get that conversation going and lead to the eventual end of capital punishment?
Yeah, many of the people who started to agitate for an inquiry into whether Tim Evans' conviction was safe or whether actually Christie had killed Evans' wife and daughter were hoping that this would galvanise the movement to abolish capital punishment. There was already a lot of kind of agitation around that at the time, and so there were lots of articles and books about the Evans case and whether Christie had framed his neighbour, and lots of rumours about Christie confessing, and the government tried to sort of close it down. So during the trial, the Attorney General, who was prosecuting Christie, tried to kind of minimise any mentions of the Evans case. And I found sort of evidence in the archives that they had suppressed some information that came out immediately after the trial that indicated a completely different solution to the one that had been reached either in Tim Evans' trial or was being speculated on in the papers. So that was very interesting indeed to sort of see that there was a memo. It was a memo from prison guard to whom Christie had disclosed information that was never released to the press or the public. And so Harry Proctor, Frin Tennis and Jesse were never able to see that. But with the lifting of the embargo on the papers after 70 years, they are now, you can read them in the National Archives.
I'm gonna not even allow you to give a hint of what that third solution might be, because of course this is a great reason for people to read the book. But as you say, it's amazing that fresh information can still come to light on cases that seem as though they happened, such a long time ago.
Yeah. I hadn't anticipated that. I thought I'd gone into the archives wanting to flesh it all out, to understand Christie, get everything I could about the details of his life and mind and of his victims' sort of personalities and histories as a way into that moment in time. But yeah, I was very surprised to come across stuff that was like, oh, maybe this is the answer, to this mystery.
Readers will have to pick up your book to discover what that is, but thank you so much for giving me some time today to talk about this case. It remains completely fascinating for all sorts of horrible reasons, but you treat it all with such respect and care and skill. So thank you so much for the book.
Thank you. Thanks.